You are Saree Makdisi, Professor of English and Comparative Literature at UCLA, and the author of several books that investigate a range of topics related to the connection between the Romantic period and British Empire. And you have also published widely on the situation in Palestine and Lebanon at the moment. In one of your most recent books, Making England Western, Occidentalism, Race and Imperial Culture, you take issue with the notion that there was such a thing as a unified Englishness or Occidentalism in England during the Romantic period, and that this existed primarily to manage the growing entity that is typically named the Orient. At the same time, empire seems to inform so much writing coming out of the early 19th century, as you demonstrate in your book. Could you say something about what the English cultural and social landscape looked like during this period, and where and how empire existed in that landscape?
That's a great and very expansive question. So I'll say a few things about it, then you can ask more. We can refine the answer. But what I would say is, first of all, there was, of course, an expansion of empire taking place in the Romantic period. At the same time, there was a great deal of heterogeneity within British society and culture and the political system and so forth that was fracturing in all kinds of directions. So what we see at that moment is a kind of overlap or convergence between an internal set of realignments and an external set of realignments. And they don't always work in coordination with each other. So you get these strange gaps where the let's say the British elite is one, that's a kind of shorthand to talk about what's going on. And of course the point is also the British elite was itself changing. One kind of elite was taking the place of an older kind of elite. So that's part of what's at stake here. But as all these shifts were taking place, there were people who were interested in what was going on, of course, in the overseas realm of empire. But there were also people interested in the ways in which certain populations at home seemed to resemble in various kinds of ways, culturally and aesthetically and intellectually and otherwise, various overseas populations. So that what starts to be seen from a certain perspective is a kind of alignment in that our others, so to speak, at home look awfully like or act like or seem like those others out there that we're colonizing. And that's a process that begins, I would say, in the 1790s and kind of accelerates. It takes off in a much more systematic way later in the 19th century, but you can see already in the first third or so of the 19th century, it's beginning to be formulated and to be expressed. So, for example, one thing that I've been fascinated by, and I talk about this in Making England Western, is the kind of explosion in discourses around London of so-called Arabs in London. And when I first came across that reference, I thought that they were talking about like actual Arabs who would, and no doubt there were real Arabs in London. But it turns out when I dug a little bit, I didn't have to dig that much. It took a little bit of digging to find out that they weren't talking about actual Arabs. They were talking about people who we would today consider to be white and English, who are seen from this perspective to be so different and so aberrant and so not us that they must be them in effect. And then why Arab in particular rather than, let's say, African or Indian or some other kind of otherness? Because Arabs were seen to be shiftless and wandering and restless and nomadic, and there were all these kinds of associations developed at the time between shiftless, wandering populations inside and outside Britain, and hence again, as the empire was refocused and as it revitalized its energies in the early 19th century, there are explicit links made between these two different populations and the way it's the same we need to manage them at home and overseas. So there's a fascinating set of intellectual and institutional histories that take place that other people have written about. For example, Pablo Mukherjee has written about the ways in which the early development, let's say, of policing in England happened in parallel with the development of British imperial policing in India. And sometimes the same people would come and go back and forth, because managing that population was seen to be the same as managing this population, because basically they're equally violent or dangerous or subversive in various ways. Similarly, and again, historians and others have talked about this as well, and it comes up in my book, missionary societies, when they sent out missionaries in the early 19th century, going on through the 19th century, but when they sent out missionaries to, let's say, Africa or Arabia or India or wherever, they would often send, exactly the same societies would often send missionaries to, let's say, the East End of London, because the populations, again, were seen to be basically equivalent or the same, or to a certain extent even interchangeable. And so what's going on is this realignment, and it takes a long time through the 19th century for a sense of us to be consolidated in a British or English or even Western sense, as opposed to them who are now outside, who are firmly in the actual Orient, so to speak. That is to say, in East Asia and West Asia and Southwest Asia and North Africa and so forth. So that otherness gets pushed outside to a certain extent. It's never absolute. It's always, these are always tendencies, and they're very dynamic, and they start and stop a lot in the 19th century. But that's kind of where we go from the early 19th century towards the middle and the end of the 19th century. A more, let's say, consolidated sense of Britishness or Englishness at home, as opposed to a stronger sense of the Orient, in this case, out there. But there's a lot of messy overlap in between those two moments, which I find fascinating.
Thank you. If Britain or even England was this diverse and heterogeneous society, why, if this is the case, post-colonial scholarship insisted on representing it as an already formed monolithic metropolis from which empire radiated?
That's a great question, and it's actually one of the funny things about much post-colonial studies is that it emphasizes the heterogeneity and diversity of colonized or colonial or ultimately post-colonial societies, which is of course true. But the point here isn't to say that there's a kind of equivalence between imperial power and colonized society, because there isn't. There are definite differences in power, for example, between these two social and political orders. That's important to point out. Having said that, in a way, some scholarship is taken for granted the empire's own claim about its internal sense of homogeneity and its sense of identity internally, skipping over, the presence of, for example, the Basques in Spain, or Sicilians in Italy, or people in the north of England, or in Wales or Ireland or Scotland, of course, but also in London too. So there's this sense of incredible diversity that's there, that a lot of scholarship just hasn't taken seriously enough. And it's true in post-colonial studies. It's also, I think, true in a lot of Romantic studies and 18th century studies. Tends to take for granted just how consolidated Britain was in the 18th and 19th centuries, as opposed to India or the Caribbean or Africa or other overseas places. Is a sense that, well, of course they were white, and they already had a sense of themselves as an imperial power. And it's not true, because they, some of them did maybe, but those people who were trying to articulate the interests of the British Empire, when they, as I said before, when they looked at home domestically, they saw a great deal of difference that they found terrifying to a large extent, and certainly, the sense of these people are not like us. It raises again the question of who's us, how do we define who we are, who makes those definitions, what's at stake in those definitions. And I think it's important for scholarship to take into account the sense of diversity at home as well as overseas in this imperial context. Partly because, as I said before, the empire itself was trying to find ways to manage these different populations in the same ways, at least initially, before moving on to other kinds of practices.
Thank you. There is a significant interest in the Romantic period at the moment, and we see this, for example, in the 200th anniversary of the publication of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein that's been celebrated. We see it also in Mike Leigh's upcoming film Peterloo. Can the Romantic period help us understand the present moment in time in any way?
I think it can and it can't. I think when we look back at that moment, we could find sources of inspiration. I, for instance, find the work of Blake to be admittedly inspiring, and I'll confess there's something more than merely historical interest at stake in that sense of a location of inspiration. Having said that, I also think there's some major differences between that moment and our moment, especially our moment in the U.S. in particular, because the early 19th century was still the moment of the consolidation of the British imperial project. It still wasn't. It had not reached anywhere near its peak. It was still taking off. They were still conquering new spaces and taking over new territories and populations and so forth, and they were still rising as an economic power. Whereas if we look at our contemporary moment today, it's a moment of American imperial decline, right? And so there's a loss of power, there's a gradual loss of power and of hegemony. The beginnings, not necessarily of economic decline, but certainly a loss of, in economic terms, a loss of relative loss of power and hegemony and authority in the global economic system. It's beginning to happen. So in that sense, the early 19th century in Britain is the moment of the rise of power, imperial power, and the early 21st century in America, anyway, is the beginning of the end of the American imperial project. And so they're specifically, they're out of sync with each other in that particular sense, because the people that we're talking about, Shelley and Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley and all of them, really, Blake and so forth, we're all contesting the rise of power. Whereas these days we're dealing with the kind of the remnants of power and the kind of realignments that happen in a gradually declining imperial power and its after shadows and afterlives and so forth, which just makes for a different kind of situation, I think, historically.
That brings us to the present moment in time. And you've written frequently about Palestine and Lebanon in your writing. The relationship between the US and Palestine and Israel has been complicated since the foundation of the Israeli state after World War II, of course. Is it possible to imagine a solution to this long crisis? Or will the global geopolitical situation have to drastically change for progress to be made?
That's a great question. I think absolutely yes, we can imagine. We can even see the beginning of what such a solution would look like. And the answer takes two different shapes. On the one hand, in terms of what I was just talking about, the end of American empire, this is very important because the Israeli state project has been supported by the American empire pretty much from the beginning. And so the decline of American empire also translates into the decline of American support for Israel ultimately, maybe not right now, but that's certainly on the horizon, I think. It's no longer to be unquestioned because American influence overseas is not what it once was. That's a major issue. In the more short term, like what we can see palpably already right now, the Israeli state has officially declared itself to be, not declared itself, it has officially stripped away the various kinds of rubrics that have allowed it to pretend to be a liberal democratic state. It has, for example, recently passed a law that says we are the nation state of the Jewish people, which of course means that all the talk that they'd had about Palestinian citizens of the state being treated equally, which they never were and they still aren't, but there was this kind of language of we are a liberal state. That's all gone out the window now. Another way of saying that is that the Israeli state project of apartheid, both internally and in the occupied territories, is more naked than it ever was. People are more aware of it than they ever were. And what that means is that the project of boycotts and divestments and sanctions is accelerating. And what that means in turn is that, as we saw in the case of the apartheid era South Africa, the realignments that take place didn't depend on governments to intervene or diplomatic realignments, let's say, but rather on citizens of goodwill around the world taking into account what they see before them and acting accordingly. So what I'm saying is, in the long run, I think the loss of American power and hegemony will ultimately undermine the Israeli state project, which is dependent on and has always been dependent on American largesse and support, diplomatically, politically, economically, financially, billions and billions of dollars, but also diplomatic cover in the UN. As that recedes, I think inevitably the Israeli state project will also kind of be the blow at the international scene. But in the more short run, the increasing visibility and even nakedness of Israeli apartheid has shocked people around the world, in Europe and America, and of course throughout the third world as well, and has led to, again, the loss of Israeli kind of narrative hegemony, and hence the beginning of increasing isolation. You see it in all kinds of ways, all kinds of boycotts, all kinds of actions that are taking place in the realm of music, for example, stars refusing to play in Israel. In the realm of sports, there are other boycotts that have taken place and are accelerating as well. And I think that will also lead to the end of apartheid in Israel, which means, of course, ultimately the creation of a state that treats all of its citizens equally, which is, of course, something that I believe in ardently as somebody who believes in equal rights and equality of everybody before the law. So I think that the end of a kind of racist state project is on the agenda, and I think the solution that we should look for is a state of equal democratic rights for all of its citizens. That includes the occupied territories, those Palestinians expelled in 1948 and their descendants, and of course Israeli Jews as well in one state. That seems like the obvious only way out.
Thank you.
My pleasure.